Good evening, everyone. I'm Michelle Witcher, Director of Arts and Letters Live here at the Dallas Museum of Art, and I am delighted to welcome all of you to our event this evening featuring Kathleen Kent in conversation with David McCloskey. I'd like to also acknowledge our virtual viewers this evening. I can assure you that you're in for a treat with Kathleen's new novel, Black Wolf. This book is suspenseful, beautifully written, well-researched, and quite simply, a thrilling read. If you haven't already purchased a copy, be sure to pick one up in the DMA store and join us for the book signing after her conversation with David, immediately following the event. We will do an audience Q&A, so if you have a question that you would like to ask Kathleen or David, please raise your hand and one of our staff members will bring you a wireless microphone. And if you can be patient with us and wait for the microphone, it's very helpful for our virtual viewers so that they can also hear what's happening in the auditorium. DMA members enjoy free parking in the garage, but if you're not a DMA member, please find one of our volunteers after the program so that we can give you a 50% off parking voucher for the garage. I'd like to mention a couple of upcoming events that will be of interest to this audience. On Tuesday, April 25th, New York Times bestselling author David Grann will discuss his new book, The Wager, a page-turning story of shipwreck, survival, and savagery, culminating in a court-martial that reveals a shocking truth. David's book, Killers of the Flower Moon, was a finalist for the National Book Award, and a film adaptation is on the way, due out May of 2023, directed by Martin Scorsese and starring Leonardo DiCaprio and Robert De Niro. Yes, very exciting. On Tuesday, May 9th, we have the honor of featuring Abraham Verghese, author of the global sensation Cutting for Stone. In his latest masterpiece, The Covenant of Water, Verghese tells the story of India's path to modernity through a single family living in Kerala from 1900 to the 1970s, moving through joy, tragedy, love, and marriage as the country around them shifts and turns. Please be sure to check out our website at dma.org for a complete up-to-date list of Arts and Letters Live events. Arts and Letters Live is supported by you in the audience, our annual season supporters, the K. Catarula Endowment for the Literary and Performing Arts, and the McGee Foundation Arts and Letters Live Endowment Fund. The Fairmont Hotel is the exclusive hotel partner, and support is provided by KERA. Now it is my pleasure to welcome our moderator for this evening, David McCloskey. David is a former CIA analyst and consultant at McKinsey & Company. While at the CIA, he wrote regularly for the President's Daily Brief, delivered classified testimony to congressional oversight committees, and briefed senior White House officials, ambassadors, military officials, and Arab royalty. He worked in CIA field stations across the Middle East throughout the Arab Awakening and conducted a rotation in the Counterterrorism Center focused on the jihad in Syria and Iraq. David's novel, Damascus Station, was praised by General David Petraeus, former director of the CIA, as the best spy novel I have ever read. I think we're in good hands this evening. Please join me in welcoming David McCloskey.
Thank you very much for that kind introduction, Michelle. So I have the distinct privilege of being in conversation tonight with Kathleen Kent, who is a New York Times bestselling author, also a Dallas native, and a two-time Edgar Award nominee for her contemporary crime novels, The Dime and The Burn. The Washington Post writes of the series, Raymond Chandler praised Dashiell Hammett for taking crime fiction out of the drawing room and into the streets. With Betty Rizek, Kathleen Kent brings those mean streets to life as excitingly as anybody has in years. And the fact that those mean streets are also the mean streets of Dallas makes that series even more wonderfully fun. The third Detective Betty book, titled The Pledge, was published in 2021. Kathleen is also the author of 3 award-winning historical novels, The Heretic's Daughter, The Traitor's Wife, and The Outcasts. She's written short stories and essays for D Magazine, Texas Monthly, and LitHub, and has been published in the crime anthology Dallas Noir. In March 2020, she was inducted into the Texas Institute of Letters for her contribution to Texas literature. But excitingly and wonderfully, we're here tonight to talk with Kathleen about her wonderful new book, which just came out today, Black Wolf, which I am in particular thrilled to discuss with her because it's a spy thriller. And as a loyal fan, an avid reader of the genre, and now dipping into it myself, I'm just delighted to be in conversation with her tonight. So let's give a big round of applause for Kathleen Kent, and we'll be in conversation tonight about Black Wolf. Kathleen.
Before we get started, I just wanted to say thanks to Michelle Witcher, the DMA, and all of her wonderful staff that worked so hard to make these stellar author presentations. I'm so grateful to be here. I want to wish family and friends a wonderful Valentine's Day, and to thank David in particular for agreeing to be in conversation. It's going to be, he'll talk about what he can.
No, well, thank you for being in conversation with me, Kathleen, tonight. And I thought, say a few words just about Black Wolf before I let you talk about it, and we'll try not to spoil anything tonight, because there are a bunch of wonderful twists and turns in here. But I think that this book was wonderful to me in so many respects. The first, just being from a storytelling standpoint, I think it does what any great story does, and it brings you in and it makes you care about the characters who are involved, sort of good, bad, and ugly. And there's a lot of those, sometimes in the same person, in this book, but it brings you in, it's propulsive, there's wonderful twists in it. There's a serial killer threaded in here, which we'll talk more about tonight, which I think was just a delightful, weirdly delightful addition to this book. I enjoyed it immensely. And importantly, it also, I think, brings us into a place, Minsk, of this sort of twilight period of the Soviet Empire, and you can really taste and smell and feel the city. It's almost like the setting is a character in and of itself. It's a highly immersive novel and just a wonderful ride. So congratulations.
Thank you, David. Thanks.
And I think I wanted to just ask first off, this novel, tell us about what's Black Wolf all about?
Black Wolf is a fictional rendering of the waning days of the former Soviet Union. I was very fortunate to have been a civilian contractor to the Department of Defense and spent almost a decade in and out of Belarus, what was at the time Soviet, the Belarusian Soviet, and Kazakhstan. And our mission was to be the instrument of turning swords to plowshares. We were to deconstruct, decommission weapons of mass destruction. And I'm sure some of you are part of the duck and cover generation. You're old enough to remember the exercises in school where they told us to hide under our desk in case of a nuclear attack, which would of course keep us safe, right? Growing up in the 50s and the 60s and the 70s, the Soviet Union was, the evil empire. We were constantly aware that our major threat for national security was coming from the Soviet Union. And if not overtly with nuclear weapons, then covertly through the Cold War, spies. And a lot of us came of age reading spy novels. Jean Le Carré is one of the grandfathers of the great spy novel. And they were enemy number one for a very long time. And I was keenly aware of this. And when I went to work as a civilian contractor, I wasn't aware at the very beginning, but I was made aware that in 1990, which was a few months after the fall of the Berlin Wall in November of 1986, the collective Soviet Union, which would later become 15 independent republics, had 27,000 nuclear weapons. Now, I knew that they were a nuclear power, but I had no idea that there were that many nuclear weapons pointed at Western Europe and the United States. The other thing that became very clear very quickly was that they had enough fissionable material, high-grade uranium, to make not a few thousand nuclear weapons, but 100,000 more nuclear weapons. So, and that's not even counting the biological and the chemical weapons. So this was the stuff of nightmares. But 3 men did more to save the Western world, and one of them, Ash Carter, a lot of you have heard of, but the other 2 were senators, Sam Nunn and Richard Lugar, became aware of this, and they made it their mission to start a program which became the Cooperative Threat Reduction Program to dismantle and destroy these nuclear weapons. So when I first started going to Belarus, that's what we were charged with, to decommission these weapons and try to keep the nightmares at bay.
One of the things that I love about the novel is that this question around what is going to happen to these weapons doesn't feel resolved. You know, in our world today, it feels resolved, and maybe inevitable almost, that it would turn out just fine.
Yeah.
I like the atmosphere of uncertainty and even fear that kind of permeates this book in a number of different ways, but in particular with the characters who see that this could be the future and are working, among other things,
right,
to sort of desperately prevent it. So, as I mentioned in my introduction, you're the author of a superb crime thriller series. This, I think it's fair to say, is your first dip into writing a, dyed-in-the-wool spy thriller.
Right.
Tell us a little bit about kind of that transition and how you wound up writing this wonderful story.
Well, I loved spy novels, but after a certain period of time, after the fall of the Berlin Wall, and at least until the early 2000s, it appeared as though the former Soviet republics were going to be embracing Western technology, Western commerce. It seemed as though they could be a potential ally, and our focus in terms of the dangers to our sovereignty, to our safety, went to other places, like the Middle East.
Yeah.
And so we spent a lot of time and resources, and I thought, I had spent all of this time in and out of the former Soviet Union, and I really wanted to write about it because there was so much in transition at that time. And I thought it would be a fascinating story to tell, but I thought, that threat is over. Except that it'll be almost a year ago that Russia invaded Ukraine, and I had a sense that there was a gathering storm when I started writing Black Wolf. And I sent the finished manuscript about a week before Russia invaded Ukraine. So the timing was right, where suddenly Russia is now a big threat again. And so all of these stories, I kept a journal, which I wasn't supposed to have, but I kept a journal. And,
we won't tell anyone.
and so I used that as a resource, and it'd been 30 years, but I just felt as though I wanted to tell some of these stories because the interest in Chernobyl and radiation and the fear of nuclear armaments growing again was suddenly, it seemed relevant again. So.
I think that one of the things I loved about this novel, and I wrote a few of these down here, is that capturing that feel of that era, particularly the city itself of Minsk, which I think, we all probably know where it is, but there are very few spy thrillers that are set in Belarus.
Right.
And, the point of time in this kind of waning period of the Soviet Empire, there's just some wonderful things here. Coffee that resonated with me. Coffee that tastes like wastewater, but the tea is excellent,
the tea
right?
was excellent, right.
These hotel minders, these kind of fairly disgruntled, sturdy kind of bureaucrats of the Soviet state called the Dezhurnaya, who are,
Right.
Of course, reporting everything back to the KGB. Soviet toilet paper is coarse as sandpaper and as absorbent as sheet metal, and a wonderful anecdote that made me literally laugh out loud about Mel, your main character, using a Soviet toilet, attempting to use a Soviet toilet while wearing a pantsuit, which is sort of its own exercise.
Right.
But you've really no small amount of this authenticity, I'm sure, is coming from your experiences in the country. Maybe can you tell us a little bit more about what you were doing in that time period in Belarus? Kind of how did that where did you sort of draw authenticity from that, and then where did you make stuff up to make the story so wonderful?
Right. It's being a novelist, I have the privilege of making stuff up. David had a totally different problem because when working with the CIA, writing Damascus Station, you had to get clearance for the manuscript.
That is true. Yes.
I didn't have any clearance at all. I was
I'm very
free to make
envious
stuff
of
up,
that,
but it was based in reality, the day-to-day, the nitty-gritty stuff. It was like going to another universe, because I had in my mind, this was a world-class power, and it had been until Afghanistan broke the back of the Soviet Union, and they put all of their resources into the military. The best food, the best equipment, the best clothing. And the civilians were left increasingly bereft of the necessities. The GUM, the GUM, the big department stores, you'd see people lined up for blocks, and they might be selling one thing. They might be selling boots, or they might be selling soap, or they might be selling just that one thing. And there was no guarantee at the end of the day, after you'd been in line for 5 hours, that there would be anything left. So I think the thing that surprised me the most, first of all, the warmth of the people. They were at first very suspicious, as we were of them, but any kind of diplomacy is built on relationships. Even clandestine service is built on building relationships and trust, and that comes over time. And the Russian people were very warm. They were a little bit, they were a little dour. My favorite joke, and a KGB agent told me this joke. He said, "What's the difference between a Russian optimist and a Russian pessimist?" He said, "The Russian pessimist says things cannot get any worse. And the Russian optimist says, oh, yes, they can." But living life in the former Soviet Union and afterwards was very difficult, very harsh, but very warm. But it was really draining when you knew that you were going to be watched and listened to 24/7. Every phone call was recorded. Every one of our translators and guides were KGB.
Right.
You couldn't go anywhere without being followed. The dezhernaya, the hall monitors, it's a peculiarity of the Soviet Union that in every hotel, whether it was, and we stayed in the Planeta Hotel, which I write about in Black Wolf, and this was the premier hotel for the Soviet officials and for the athletes, the really famous athletes. But in every hall, you had a dezhernaya, which was most typically a much older woman, and sometimes she was old enough to have been a part of the Second World War, and she would wear her medals across her sweater. And she would give you the key to your room, and you'd go in your room, but when you left your room, you'd leave the key with a dezhernaya. And she would keep a little notebook. She'd keep the times of when you came and when you left. If you made a call from your hotel room, you could hear the click, click, click of the KGB listening. The mirrors were two-way, and the way you found out if your mirror was two-way was that if you see a regular reflective mirror and you put your finger against the surface, you can see there's a little gap before the reflection of your finger. With a two-way mirror, there's no gap. It's just, the reflection is right up against your finger. So it's an incredibly exhausting and debilitating feeling to know that, and even though you're on official business, there's no break. You know that wherever you go, you couldn't go to the restroom without someone coming with you, and you mentioned the pantsuits. My husband Jim tonight said, "Oh, you're wearing a pantsuit." which I wore pantsuits all the time when I was working. You know, it was just comfortable and it would look professional, and that's what I did. But in Russia at that time, women wore dresses exclusively unless they were at their dacha and they were, you know, digging up their root vegetables. And so I was constantly questioned, why are you wearing pantsuits? It's, you know, it's not womanly, it's not feminine. And I was warned, and it's going to be especially difficult when you go to the facilities. And I found out why, because for those of you who have traveled to third world countries, and Russia, you know, technologically very advanced, but their plumbing left a lot to be desired. So when you go into the stall, you'd have two raised little platforms to put your feet on, and then there was just a hole. And so wearing a pantsuit, you practically have to get undressed completely, whereas if you had a skirt, you could just, you know, hike it up. So I learned that wearing a dress was a little bit more convenient when you were working in the Soviet Union.
And when I read that in the book, I thought that there's a shimmering authenticity to
there
that
is,
detail in it.
Exactly. Yeah.
Well, so the book is entitled Black Wolf.
Right.
And we've been talking a little bit about this kind of pervasive sense of paranoia and fear. And I do think there were parts in the book where I could almost feel the character's exhaustion from just constantly being monitored. But
Right.
Black Wolf was referring to the head of the Belarusian KGB,
Right.
who is based on a real person.
Right.
Can you talk a little bit about that person? I found that character in particular, Martin Kowalczyk, to be really, he's fearsome, but he's sort of dignified and almost has this elegant kind of chess master air to him.
Right.
And at the same time, we see and can feel the sort of brutality that he has inflicted and is capable of. Maybe tell us a little bit about that character.
Yeah, Martin Kowalczyk is kind of a composite of different KGB officers that I met. A lot of them, as you can guess, gained seniority through brutality. They have a term called wet work, which they use to talk about assassins. The KGB was incredibly brutal, especially in the early days. And I thought that it would be interesting to develop a KGB. And so the head of the KGB in Moscow, the first directorate of the KGB, it was an umbrella organization. All of the other republics, like Belarus and Kazakhstan, had their own head of the KGB, but they answered to the first directorate. So I thought it would be really interesting to, as you said, a chess player who was intelligent, who was cunning, and had a sense of empathy and had a sense of sympathy, but yet that was superseded by his duty to his country and to the Soviet people. So in my mind's eye, when I was writing Martin, I sort of envisioned an Alec Guinness character, somebody who was dignified, and yet when he walked into the room, I described it, the only time you hear Martin Kowalczyk's footsteps is when he's carrying your coffin. So it's someone who was ruthless, and yet he forms a very as close as he can get to Melvina, the main character.
Yeah.
So I just think with villains, it's much more interesting to give them a human side. You know, they like kitty cats and puppy dogs as they're lining people up and shooting them. Just something to counterbalance the brutality. And also there was a lot of brutality in the book because I talk about a serial killer, the Svislok Strangler. The Svislok was the main river that runs through Minsk, and he was based on a real serial killer. And in November of 1990, the Soviet Union brought to justice a man named Andrei Chikatilo. And he was probably the most prolific serial killer that the world had ever seen. He murdered his way through Ukraine and Russia for at least 20 years. The oddity of Soviet justice was that you could be arrested and shot for all kinds of misdeeds, crimes against the state. But the one thing they refused to recognize was that the Soviet Union could have a serial killer, could have a homicidal maniac, because as Stalin said, there is no murder in paradise. So all of these women and primarily children, they were finding their bodies, terribly mutilated, and he got the nickname the Butcher of Rostov, because Rostov Oblast was where they'd found most of his victims. And it wasn't until the fall of the Berlin Wall and a relaxation and an acceptance of Western policing methods were able to come in that they finally solved the case. And he was brought to prison, and he was accused and indicted for 53 murders, but they think it could have been over 100. They don't know for sure. So I was very aware of Chikatilo when I was traveling the former Soviet Union, and so I thought, I would up the ante. Having a murderous KGB agent wasn't quite enough, so I added a serial killer just to spice things up.
Well, and yeah, I wanted to ask about that because I thought, it really does bring some real mystery and heightens the tension throughout the entire novel, of which there would be plenty if our friend, the Shvizlak Strangler, wasn't in the novel.
Right.
But you also do a wonderful job, and I won't give anything away, of creating some real tension around who this person is in the novel. And I think it also wouldn't give anything away to say that after reading this book, I am now incapable of eating dishes that feature mushrooms. Maybe do you want to? I don't know if you want to say a little bit about that piece of it, but
sure.
in particular, maybe the fascination that Russians have with mushrooms.
Yeah, one of the most beloved pastimes in the Russian republics is mushroom gathering, and they start in the spring and it goes through the fall, and it's generational knowledge. They know what they can pick, what they can eat, and everything has mushrooms in it. And so I thought, what can I ruin? This
wonderful
cuisine, this wonderful tradition. And so I thought, this serial killer is using his victims in a way as a way to fertilize his mushrooms. And so creepily enough, he uses those in stews and soups and things that he feeds his friends. So it's just another creepy element.
It's very creepy, yes, yes.
But again, it's based on tradition and and I bring a lot of alternative chapters of the Strangler. We don't know who he is to the end of the book.
Yeah.
And I wanted to kind of the Soviet Union lost more of its citizens during the Second World War than any other country probably combined. It was incredibly brutal. Millions of people starved to death, and this was even before Stalin got started on his purges. They just lost probably a quarter or more of their citizenry. And so not to excuse his deeds, but to explain the brutality that he went through that gave him his mindset of brutality. So I wanted to, to delve a little deeper into his psychology.
That's right. And one of the things that I really did enjoy about the Belarusian characters in this novel is that I think you do a wonderful job of showing kind of the gamut of how people responded to an experience under Soviet rule that did a lot of things to mess up relationships and perspectives on morality. But your characters respond very differently to that. And you have Belarusian characters who are oftentimes on the opposite side of our, friends working for the CIA in this novel.
Right.
Who, are very human, and are trying to grapple with this kind of tension of how do they live in a system that really restricts freedom and agency. And make the best decisions that they can for them and for themselves and their families.
Right.
I do want to talk a little bit about Melvina Donlevy, our main character in the book. So she is a super recognizer who doesn't forget a face, and she has this wonderful, I think, inner strength, and she is brave, and she is a very strong, capable woman who is sent on this very difficult assignment. Maybe tell us a little bit about her special gifts, and the creation of her character, and whether or not this kind of super recognizer power, like, is that based in, how much of that's real, how much of that's drawn from pure fantasy?
When I started working on the book and was developing my main characters, I wanted to give Melvina, who's the main protagonist, some kind of notable characteristic. And I was kind of struggling with that for a while. And my husband Jim brought an article to me, and he said, "Look at this." He said, "This is really interesting." And it was a woman named Kelly Hersey, who lived in England. And she had been used by the police to, she was shown pictures of ruffians, people who went to sporting events and caused chaos and damage. And she was shown a picture, and then she was shown a video of people, thousands of people pouring into a stadium. And she was able to pick out each one of these targets. The Scotland Yard became aware of her talents and started using her. And as it turns out, after testing her, her hit rate, her recognition rate was 100%. She could be shown a picture once and then shown a video of a train station or a stadium, and she was able to pick out that person.
Wow.
They called them, and this term wasn't coined until the mid-2000s, I think. But only 1% of the world's population has this ability to, you see a person once and you remember them forever. It's implanted, embedded in your brain. And I thought, well, that would be a superlative gift without the supernatural that Mel could have. She's a young CIA agent. She's only 26. She's on her first assignment. And she's trains with the FBI, and then the CIA gets the idea, they find out about this talent. And at the Soviet Union at that time, 1990, I mentioned Sam Nunn and Richard Lugar before, the senators. Sam Nunn had gone to Moscow 2 weeks after Mikhail Gorbachev was released in the Crimea, where a coup had been attempted, and then there was a populist uprising, and Gorbachev was reinstated. So Sam Nunn went to with a delegation, including I think Ash Carter, and pulled Gorbachev aside, and he said, "About those nukes, President, what are you doing to secure your arsenal?" And he said, "Let's change the subject." And he was really alarmed by that, because some of this fissionable material was kept in facilities that were locked merely with a padlock. There were silos that were unmanned, but they still had armed nuclear warheads. So he became very, very concerned about this. And as it turns out, that countries like Iran were very much interested in taking advantage of the chaos, coming into the country and buying, begging, stealing whatever they could. The Soviet Union, especially the military and the academicians, were very vulnerable at that time because they weren't being paid. The internal structure had fallen apart. People who had factory workers, everything was falling apart, which gave entree to the Bratva, which was the Soviet mafia. But it also opened the door for Pakistan and Iran and other countries to come in and pay a lot of money to gain access to the technology or the weapons themselves. So Sam Nunn, going back to Washington, sounded the alarm, and he said, "We have to do something." And Dick Cheney at the time, who was, I think he was the
Secretary of Defense.
Secretary
at
of
the time.
Defense,
Yeah.
said, "Are you crazy? We've just spent 50 years trying to bankrupt these people, and now you want to spend money, you want to raise millions of dollars?" And he said, "Well, defense can do one of two things. We can be aggressive in our defense, or we can be proactively defensive, in peaceful terms." And it was through his efforts and some other people that we were able to start the CTR program. And they probably did more to keep us safe than many other efforts after that.
Yeah, it's kind of remarkable when you look. I mean, there's the collapse of the Soviet Union. There's a whole host of different, potential accidents that have occurred with nuclear weapons. That we've sort of been on a, fine wire here with these things for a long time.
Right.
And one of the things you allude to in the book, and you mentioned it, is the shadow of kind of Chernobyl that hangs over
Right.
Belarus and the characters in the book. Maybe talk a little bit about that, because it feels, I really liked in the book how it was never a focus, but it was this thing that sort of permeated.
Right.
That permeated the country. It had affected farmland. It had affected, a bunch of birth defects in Belarus as a
Right.
result of it. Maybe just talk a little
Yeah.
bit about how that was woven and what that was and how it was woven into the novel.
Yeah, Chernobyl was a nightmare that the full impact of it wasn't fully realized for years later, because the Soviet Union, true to their policy, underplayed severely the amount of radiation that was scattered and the locations where it ended up. The maps that they shared with the U.S. government was that 20% of Belarus had been irradiated, the southern part, and they called that the exclusion zone, and it's still called the exclusion zone. They give what they call dark tourist visits there, where you can actually go and bring your own Geiger counter and see, watch it light up. It's not until after we started going into Belarus that we suddenly realized that 80% of the country was irradiated.
Wow.
Reports started coming out that infant mortality rate had soared. There was a phenomenon called Chernobyl heart, which children were born with, that was directly related to radiation poisoning. Cancers skyrocketed. So besides the worry about the intelligence service and being reported on and being followed all the time, in the back of all of our minds was the thought that the air that we're breathing, the food that we're eating, everything that we are in contact with could be irradiated and may not show up for 5 or 10, may not show up until 20 years had passed. So that was something that was a dark thought in the back of everybody's mind. And then after Putin invaded Ukraine, he took over Chernobyl, and that was a nightmare that was reawakened.
I wanted to ask you a little bit about this arc that goes from the Belarus, the sort of post-Soviet, era of this book to today. I mean, can you talk a little bit about, how have these, and frankly, he's not mentioned in the book by name, but Alexander Lukashenko, who's the president of Belarus, former pig farmer, if I'm not mistaken.
Former pig farmer, that's right.
Pig farmer to the president. There's sort of this very direct connection in a lot of ways between the era of the book and the people that are now running these countries today. Maybe just talk a little bit about the arc that we've seen in Belarus and this part of the world from the time of the novel to now.
Yeah, it was, so Alexander Lukashenko was made president in 1992, and I have a picture of my boss shaking hands with him when he was newly elected. And there were great hopes that Lukashenko seemed to be welcoming. And now, as we know, he's still president for life. Nursultan Nazarbayev, who was the president of Kazakhstan for 30 years, he's been recently replaced, but you had these autocratic leaders that came into power under the guise of a democratic process and then hanging around. You know, Putin is another example. Yeah. Putin started out in the KGB. He grew up in the ranks of the KGB, was the head of the KGB, and then he became president and is, you know, for life. And I think that for a long time, I mean, most people didn't even hear of Kazakhstan until Borat. You know, it was just, you know, where's Belarus? Well, now, because of current events, people know where Belarus is. And I think, you know, I feel a personal sadness that there was this exhilaration and this giddiness, you know, when the wall came down, that there was hope for this. And I think, because I wanted to ask you about, even though you served in Syria, in the mid-2000s, and it was a different time and a place, but what really struck me in reading your book, Damascus Station, which is, as Michelle said, General David Petraeus said it was the best spy novel he'd ever read, and it's just fascinating. It's really great. And what struck me was that you were in Syria in 2010 during the Arab Spring. And can you talk a little bit, because I'd love to hear your viewpoint of how, we were talking before, how we couldn't, it was something that kind of seemed organic and kind of happened. It was a confluence, a perfect storm. But you were there when the Arab Spring happened.
Yeah.
What were your expectations of what was going to happen then?
Yeah, you know, I think there really are some pretty direct parallels between, you know, Eastern Europe of 89, 90, and then, you know, the Arab world or the Near East of 2010, 2011. You know, in Syria, it was very, you know, it was this sort of exhilarating feeling because there was a mass psychological shift that was happening among ordinary people in real time. And it was not dissimilar to, I think, the way a lot of, you know, Poles or Ukrainians or, you know, would have felt in 89, 90, because it's this feeling of you live in a very repressive system that has really drained you of a lot of your own agency and freedom over time. And then all of the sudden, and you kind of are in some ways politically deadened because you can't, there's just no room for maneuver. You know, the state, the system kind of is what it is. And ordinary Syrians felt that very deeply. They called it the wall of fear, you know, was just there. And there was, you know, 4 main security services. It's just kind of hard to wrap your head around that they all work against each other, they all work against you, and they're the most effective organizations and institutions in the country, because the rest of, you know, sort of civil society, governmental organizations have all pretty much been hollowed out inside Syria. And so the thing that you as an ordinary Syrian are sort of pushing up against day to day to get building permits, to get marriage licenses, are these security services. And they're the ones who can, you know, they can arrest you pretty much without cause. They can, you know, in some cases, torture you. I mean, these are brutal, these can be very brutal organizations. And it was fascinating and very exhilarating overnight to watch how all of a sudden ordinary people weren't as afraid of them anymore. And it just shifted.
And you said that policymakers were surprised.
Oh, yeah,
everyone
was shocked. Because it had been that way in Syria since, you know, the 70s.
Right.
And I think that, you know, one of the things as an analyst that was really kind of, that I learned in that period was that our ability to predict these things is pretty much impossible, because we're running up against the limits of really human cognition. You know, it's a whole bunch of people who in pretty much a matter of weeks are deciding that they're not afraid of this thing anymore, and they're willing to do things that they had never been willing to do. So some of those protests in Syria, you know, in the summer of 2011 in particular, were massive. I mean, we're talking about a country that its security services were set up by former Nazis and trained by the Soviet Union throughout the Cold War.
Right.
And then all of a sudden you've got tens of thousands of people out on the streets in some cases, you know, kind of flouting them. It was really a shocking, and for me, watching that as an analyst, like a very exhilarating thing.
Right.
And it's been very saddening and tragic to see how it's gone. You know, the trajectory of that became very dark and dire, and the whole country broke apart. And again, it's not without its dissimilarities, or not without its similarities rather, to a lot of these post-Soviet states where the trajectory has been really uneven.
Right.
Yeah.
Can you talk a little bit about, you were an analyst, and so your reports
Yep.
went to very superior officials, decision makers.
Yeah.
Can
Yeah.
you talk about the difference between an analyst and a case officer? Because when you think about the traditional spy novel, you're thinking about an officer on the ground, a CIA
Right.
officer. So can you talk a little bit about what the difference is between
Yeah.
those two?
Well, so I was an analyst, and I realized after about maybe 20 minutes of trying to outline a novel that if I tried to make the analyst the star, it wasn't going to be as exciting. So I had to put that.
Right.
I had to put that aside. No,
Just the facts, ma'am.
Just the facts. Well, so I think that there are some helpful comparisons to journalism in thinking about these jobs. So, a case officer is the person who recruits, or really spots, assesses, develops, and hopefully recruits a source.
Assets,
An
which you would
asset
call
or
assets,
source
right.
overseas, for the most part, who is usually a foreign national who has access to information that we want. Access to secrets in the way that a journalist here who's developing a source, who might work at a company who is doing something unethically, let's say, that source might provide information to a journalist that could then be published. So the case officer is in a lot of ways operating kind of like a clandestine journalist, trying to find these sources, recruit them, figure out the secrets and stories that they have. They have to do all of the assessment of is this source, do they actually have the access they say they do? What really motivates them?
The motivation is really important.
Is really key because it was sort of stock in trade, I would say, among my case officer colleagues to think that there had to be something a little bit wrong with you if you were going to commit treason, and if a CIA officer was going to be able to convince you to do that or walk with you through that process. But there could be monetary reasons for it. There are psychological reasons for it. There can be
ideological.
In Russia today, in the Soviet Union, there could be real ideological reasons for doing that.
Right.
But the case officer had to understand and really be a student of human behavior, motivation. And it's a very interesting relationship that would be developed between a case officer and a source or asset, because there's a high degree of, in the best relationships, there's a very significant amount of trust that goes into that, and it's real. And there's also a certain amount of kind of manipulation as well, because we need that information. The whole reason the CIA exists is to provide the United States with an informational advantage over our adversaries, and so we need this information. But at the same time, we have to deal with this source in a frankly respectful kind of partnership-based way, even as we desperately need what they have. So the case officer is the one doing that work. The analyst, you could almost think about this as the part of the journalist that's writing the story and taking in information from dozens of different sources. So that could be dozens of different human sources, that could be satellite imagery, that could be intercepted phone communications, that could be academic field work from a country, and building a kind of comprehensive picture of an answer to a specific question that matters. So in the early days of Syria, when I was writing for the Obama White House, it would be, what are the different scenarios for how this could go down? Can Assad hold on for the next 6 months? There's some intelligence questions that we're trying to answer, and we're
it's coming from
using
all different sources.
We're using a whole bunch of different sources, some of whom are human sources in Syria, some of which are, intercepted phone calls to answer those questions.
Right. Fascinating.
Yeah, and I did also want to ask you, because in Black Wolf you have a team of
Right.
CIA officers who are in Belarus who are, on this very important mission, and you've done, I think, a really wonderful job of capturing the sort of mentality, very interesting kind of tradecraft set up in here with how they're getting information back, which I found really, really wonderful. Can you talk a little bit about the fact and the fiction of the spycraft in the novel, and kind of how you went about building that world?
Right. Well, unlike David, I was spy adjacent. I guess I was the analyst. I was writing
exactly.
reports, and then they would be fed to the DOD and then to the NSA and all different intelligence agencies. And so when we would travel, sometimes the people from State Department would come, wink, wink. That was often the cover.
I don't know what you're talking about.
Yeah, well, that was often the State Department personnel.
Sure.
Served many different functions. And one of the characters that I write about in Black Wolf, Benjamin Franklin, Benjamin Worthington Franklin, and he's a young African-American man who was in the Army and he's in the CIA, and he's a vegetarian. Well, which is just preposterous
tough,
when you're
tough
which
in
is
Soviet Belarus. Yeah.
In Soviet Belarus, where there are no green vegetables and it's all root vegetables and meat, bad meat at every meal. So the poor guy almost starved to death, but he came along as an independent observer. But we kind of knew that. But it was of all, and he spoke a little Russian. But of all of the people that could have gone, the Soviet people saw very few black individuals. The only black people that they saw were through the lens of propaganda. They were either starving Africans, or they were downtrodden and very violent, Americans. So it was a very skewed view. And so I thought, that Benjamin would be a good representation of the difficulties in negotiating your way through, because you're not always the round hole in the round peg in the round hole. So I learned a few things just kind of listening and paying attention to what was going on, and there was a lot of sort of liberating documents that were photographed and then returned.
Yes.
So that was part of it. So I wasn't, my primary duty was not intelligence, was not spying, but I was expected to keep my ears open, and I did, and so I could report that back, and one of the things that I talk about in the book, which happened, it's one of those strange moments that could be very benign, but it stuck in my mind. We in the mid-1990s, we hosted the Deputy Prime Minister from Belarus, Stanislav Bril, to come over, and we hosted him, and we had a delegation, and we were standing talking, and he was practicing his bad English, and I was practicing my bad Russian, and we were standing talking, and there was kind of a lull in the conversation, and there was a tape playing of kind of soft pop music in the background, and Sting's song Russians came on, and the orchestral interlude is from Prokofiev. And he recognized it. He said, "Oh, Prokofiev." And I said, "Yes, that's Prokofiev." And he asked me who it was singing, and I said, "Sting." And he goes, "Sting?" I said, "Like a bee." And he said, "Oh, that's very interesting." And he said, and what's the song called? I said, "Russians." And he said, "Well, what's it about?" And I said, "Well, the line is, I hope the Russians love their children too. That with all this nuclear proliferation, that we hope that they love their children as much as we love ours." And he said, "Why would we not love our children? Why?" He was so, the statesman separated and the human being was there. And it's that moment of making that connection. I put that in the book. But you talk about relationships, and there were so many moments like that where you felt a connection, and they might divulge something, like don't walk on this street at this time because there's going to be some activity. They're going to be making some arrests. So it was sort of little pieces of information that were given to you to keep you safe.
So building off that, and we got a few minutes before we open it up to questions.
Oh, okay.
I wanted to ask you, what you kind of step back from it, other than just getting involved in an exceptionally good story. what do you hope that readers take away from the book? What are the big things that you hope that as they go through this adventure that they learn?
I think primarily it's a place and time that had been receding from contemporary memory, and I wanted to show the what fascinates me in history are the points in time where there's great transition, times of chaos, times of change, because I think it allows people, real people and fictional people, to bring forth their best and their worst attributes. And it was also a cautionary tale that these things can be resurrected, that diplomacy is really important. And, you know, not to get too political, but the Nunn-Lugar Cooperative Threat Reduction Program in many ways was a success because it eradicated the world of nuclear weapons. After World War II, we had the Marshall Plan, and we went in and invested money in the infrastructure of our former enemies. And it paid off in tremendous dividends, incalculable dividends. And now, you know, with Ukraine, we have an instance where there's a threat, you know, not just to a solitary country, but to Western Europe. And I think that if the old Soviet Union is dead, there are elements of it that are still alive and are still seeking to advance and gain territory.
Yeah, I think it's pretty striking to me as I read the book to just think about the echoes of that period and this feeling of, you know, on the part of Putin, in the sense of this was sort of a carved up empire that, you know, probably had its rightful place over a certain amount of territory and space. And, you know, I think there was maybe a sense on our part as Americans to think about the end of the Cold War, this period, as being one of sort of victory of our system over theirs. And there's an element of that that's very true.
Right.
But when you look at it through the lens of, for example, the characters in your book, particularly the Belarusian characters, you see this sense of almost, you know, this is something that's, there's promise and there's hope in some respects, but there's also this sense of this is a you know, kind of a dead empire in a lot of ways, that, you know, the result of that creates opportunities for people like Lukashenko or like a Putin to really build off of a narrative around this time as being one of chaos and kind of displacement to try to reconstitute it in some form, which I think was really created, you know, a nice echo between
there's a
the
duality,
two
you know, between hopefulness and then the reality. It's not the gaining of power, it's the keeping of power that can be so dangerous. And some things, you know, we haven't changed. I think we've changed neuronally, technologically, but emotionally we're the same funny monkeys that we've been for the last 2,000 years. So we're still fighting, we're still battling the same human weaknesses and foibles that we have all along. So.
That's right. That's well said. So what's next? I mean, what are you working on now? Is there another book with Mel coming? Maybe, I don't want to tease too much, but if you can give us any sense of what you're working on, that'd be wonderful.
Yes, I am working on a plan for a sequel. This Black Wolf takes place in Belarus. The next book will take place in Kazakhstan. And I've also started a standalone book, so I'm kind of working. I'm sort of waiting on the publisher to say go on one or the other. So I'm at the starting line. But I would love to write a sequel about it because there's a lot of story to tell in Kazakhstan. Kazakhstan still produces 15% of the world's uranium. So, I mean, it was a big player, and there was a lot of shady business going on in Kazakhstan. So there are a lot of villains to explore.
Yes, you've got a lot of opportunities to explore.
Absolutely.
That's for sure. Awesome. Well, I think we have some time for some questions. But
Questions? Yeah. And the question's for me or for David.
Yeah,
But just
sure.
remember, what goes on in Spy Club stays in Spy Club.
Or
So you were involved with this process of nuclear disarmament. How'd you ever trust that you thought they would disarm versus hide everything and say they were disarming?
That's an excellent question. The question was, how did we trust that they were going to do what they said they did? And at the beginning, that was very fraught. There was not a lot of trust because the Soviets said, well, why should we disarm? You've got all of this nuclear armament as well. So there was a bilateral agreement between first Gorbachev and then Boris Yeltsin, and then over a period of time. And a lot of times the DOD, the Department of Defense, had to renegotiate, and they had to come in, and there were 15 ultimately different republics that Belarus, Russia, and Kazakhstan having the most nuclear weapons. So they concentrated on those 3 independent republics first. But it's taken 20 to 30 years. It's only been in the last decade that Kazakhstan has fulfilled its obligation to secure its fissionable material. So it was kind of okay, we did this, now you do that. And a lot of, Sam Nunn spent a lot of time in country going and making sure that they were dismantled. A lot of the nuclear weapons were sent to Moscow, and then they were shipped to the United States. And the high-grade uranium was downgraded so that 15% of our nuclear facilities, talking about turning swords to plowshares, 15% of our nuclear power is run on old Soviet uranium that was used for bombs. So it was sort of a back and forth, and there was a lot of negotiation. Obviously, the Soviet Union did not rid themselves of all of their nuclear weapons, but we were able to dismantle at least half, to deconstruct or dismantle at least half of the arsenal. And we paid. The other thing to build goodwill was we paid for this, but also we paid for a lot of the people. You know, there were these huge complexes, military complexes, that employed 20,000 people. And once the Soviet Union fell apart, these people had no way to make a living. So part of what the American Department of Defense did was we allocated money to build a housing facility for them. To bring in medical supplies. I mean, to try to do as much as we could to stabilize while the main effort was to get rid of these nuclear weapons. And the Nunn-Lugar project is still going on, biochemical and chemical weapons as well. And they've done a tremendous job of doing that.
Kathleen, hi.
Hi.
I'm sure you're following everything that's happening over there as closer than anybody I know. And you know the people, you've been there in Belarus and by connection, Ukraine. And I think everybody sort of follows that story to some degree, and we have a sense of the pain that all those people are suffering. And it's easy to understand what a nightmare it is. But is there anything that you can think of in particular about the mentality of the people over there that maybe that Americans miss, that we just don't see? We see them getting away from Russia, the Gulag, and trying to be independent people. But what else are they thinking? What else? Is there something that is not, revealed in the media?
You're talking about the independent republics like Ukraine?
I'm talking about Ukraine, and Belarus is still under the thumb of
Right.
Russia.
Right.
I mean, what do those fake people think? I
Right.
can't believe they're really very happy with Mr. Lukashenko. And
No, they're not. And Lukashenko has kept himself in power by aligning himself with Putin. And the Belarusians are not very happy. There's a thriving black market, and there has been, and that's how people get goods and services. And Lukashenko's people kind of turn a blind eye to it. But the different republics have, to a greater or lesser degree, separated themselves from Russia. I think Kazakhstan did a very good job, now, even though Nazarbayev was president for decades. He was the most proactive in ridding the country of nuclear weapons and fissionable material. He was a very good partner with us, and he really distanced himself from Russia. And a lot of that had to do with ethnographics, because 3/4 of the population are descendants of Genghis Khan. They have their own language, they have their own ethnic identity, and they were really resentful that the higher appointments, government appointments, were to the Russians, the Slavics. So they kind of were very much invested in their independence. Belarus is more closely tied to Russia. Ukraine, there was a lot of corruption in Ukraine, but they had made great strides in becoming a very productive, independent, and embracing the West. Who would have thought that a former comedian could have been such an effective leader of the country? We'll have to wait and see what's going to happen going forward. I've heard some retired generals say that it's going to be over by the end of the summer. Other people say it's going to drag out for another couple of years. I don't know. They have a better chance of maintaining their independence with help from the U.S. and Western Europe, the NATO powers. So we'll see.
On a very significantly lighter note, what's your favorite brand of spy sunglasses?
Favorite brand of spy sunglasses?
You know, the sunglasses that you always wear.
The mirror. It's funny. The one thing that would garner attention in Belarus and Kazakhstan was if you wore sunglasses. That was suspicious right off the bat. Yeah, it's because people just didn't wear sunglasses. It just wasn't something that I don't know. What was your experience of if you wanted to remain incognito?
I don't know. I'd rather answer the Ukraine question. That seems easier. No, I don't know. I'll pivot to an anecdote about the CIA gift shop, which also sells spy stuff like sunglasses. And similar to your point on, made me think of it as your point on, if you wore anything that made you look like a spy in Belarus, you probably would have just been disappeared by the KGB immediately.
Yeah, probably.
There was, so Langley has a gift shop in it. Like any large bureaucry, there's a gift shop. AT&T has a gift shop.
Do you get a discount being
you don't get a discount actually, but there are so many wonderful things there. It's really just kind of a treasure chest of insane things. And I have a colleague who was inside the agency for about 35 years that he said this place started going downhill when we got the gift shop. That's but the article that made me think of that was that on my my second or third week at the agency, I went to the gift shop to check it out because I knew my mom would want a Christmas ornament that said CIA on it, and there was kind of in the back in this I don't know, I feel like a department store in some ways. There was a suitcase that literally had CIA printed on it, and there was a little tag below it in small print that said, "If you work at the CIA, you cannot buy this." Even at the time, as a younger person, I remember thinking like that would be a terrible decision to travel with that overseas.
That's great.
This was fascinating. Thank you both for spending your Valentine's Day with us. I wanted to pick up a little bit on what you talked about between the fall of the Berlin Wall and the uprisings in the Middle East. And one was wildly successful, the others weren't. And I was curious why you think that might have been, and more importantly, what are the lessons for the Western world to understand how can we ensure that the next uprising is successful?
That's the question was asked about the Arab Spring and the Arab uprising and the populist movement to bring down the Berlin Wall. And David and I were talking that the American government, including the intelligence agencies, were completely taken by surprise at this populist upbringing that brought thousands and thousands of people to the Berlin Wall and that came down almost overnight. Everyone was taken by surprise, and it's one of those things that you can't calculate. There was no match strike that you could point to say that was the thing that started it. It's a tipping point. It's where people, it's sort of, they're as downtrodden as they can be and they have nothing left to lose. And the other thing is, and not so much in the early 1990s because we didn't have social media, but once you turn on the light and open the door, like social media, and they were sharing a lot of social media things, once you shine a light on what's possible, you can't close that door without extreme brutality again. And people who are exposed to it and see that there are more liberties to be had. But I think in both cases, the US government was very surprised by this populist uprising. Would you agree?
I would agree. And the only thing I would add is I would think in both cases, the success of the transition was very uneven depending on the country, right? And depending on the criteria that you ascribe to success. So, in Belarus, for example, there would have been some movement toward something approaching a more open society or kind of what we might call a constitutional democracy, and there's been a tremendous amount of backsliding over the past couple decades.
Right.
In places in the Arab world, like in Tunisia, there was some success actually in the removal of an existing autocracy and the replacement of it with something that's approaching a more democratic system. In places like Syria and in Libya, these were countries that they didn't have really working institutions outside of the state-run security services. And as soon as those were eliminated or their control was reduced, it led to extremely chaotic, sort of ungoverned spaces. And then there's places like Egypt where there was a transition, but then existing, institutions like the military, not dissimilar to what the KGB,
right,
then FSB, now FSB has done
right,
in Russia, were able to sort of retrench and take power back over time. And so I think in both cases, we sort of have a perspective or a perception in our heads of the complete victory of more kind of Western-oriented democracies coming out of 1989. And I think, the further east you get, the more uneven those transitions really were. And I think something we're seeing right now in Ukraine, frankly, is really a contest now over what kind of, whether that country is going to be fundamentally something more approaching a Western European country, or whether it's going to be part of, the Russian world. And I think we're still seeing some of those, which is why I think the book was so wonderful, is it's sort of, we're seeing the connective tissue between really unfinished business,
right,
coming out of the Soviet Empire with what's going on today.
right.
We have time for one more question.
Can you talk a little bit about the relationship that Russians have with vodka and how you dealt with kind of the obligatory expectation of consuming vodka while you were there?
Very important question. Vodka. Throughout all of the decades where rampant inflation ravaged all of the republics, vodka was kept, the price was always kept low. Otherwise, there would be another uprising. It would not be so pleasant. And the vodka bottles that you would buy for like 25 cents, you get a big bottle of vodka, and there were, you know, a lot of them were made locally. The Belarusians had a particularly legal vodka made, distilled through buffalo grass, and it was probably close to 200 proof. It was deadly. It was like high octane ethanol alcohol. But there was a foil cap on the bottle because once you didn't seal it back up. Once you opened it up, you were going to finish that bottle.
It's like a can of Coke, you know.
Like a can of Coke, right? You have to finish it. And when you were at social functions, which any excuse to get together and eat, you know, whether you went to the banya, the bathhouse, or, you know, a meeting at a you know, at one of the academics' homes or wherever, they'd open a bottle of vodka or 12, and when they poured you a shot, everyone in the room was to stand up and make a toast, and at the end of the toast, you were to down the shot, and then they go on to the next and the next and the next. And it was considered highly insulting if you didn't. So I'm a really cheap date. I would have been under the table and in the hospital. So usually the people that we traveled with some U.S. diplomats or scientists, and Harvey Polikoff, who was my partner in crime and traveled with me a lot, he would always keep a glass of water, and he would sneak the water. So they were like, that American woman, she can drink us under the table. And I was drinking water the whole time. But yeah, vodka is a very important part. Oh, and so if you're ever toasting a Russian national, when you toast them, you don't cross over another person's arms. That's considered very bad luck. And if you bring flowers, you always bring an odd number of flowers. They don't have Valentine's Day, but they have International Women's Day, where the women are given flowers, but you only give an odd number, like a baker's dozen, 13, because you only bring an even number of flowers to a funeral. So I learned that the hard way. Dozen roses to my host, and he was horrified. So just these little cultural things that you learn when you're in country, and you make mistakes and then you learn. Right?
I think every book talk should end with a vodka question. I think that's wonderful. Can we give Kathleen a round of applause?
Thank you. Thanks, David.